Hey everyone, in this video we look at Jesus' sayings on the sword, which are sometimes used to make the case that Christians can kill their enemies. But does Jesus condone the use of the sword in these passages? Let's look at this, and we begin with Matthew 10 verses 34 through 36. Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household." So this saying comes in the broader context of Jesus' teaching on coming persecution for his followers. Notice he's not saying that they will use the sword, but that others will use the sword against them, as it were. Verse 35, beginning with the word "for," shows us what Jesus is talking about in verse 34. Following Jesus will not bring peace to your life, at least considered in terms of how others will treat you. Specifically here, members of your own family will reject you. So Jesus is using or speaking of the sword in a metaphorical way as something that divides as it cuts. Jesus brings a sword in that faithfulness to him will cause others to cut you off. There will be conflict. Families will be divided. That this is the correct understanding of Matthew 10, verse 34 is confirmed when we compare it to the same saying in Luke chapter 12, verses 51 through 52. Jesus says here, "Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. So here in Luke, instead of saying the word sword, he simply says division. Next, we look at Luke 22, verses 35 through 38. "And Jesus said to them, 'When I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything?' And the disciples said, 'Nothing.' And he said to them, 'But now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack. And let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me.' And he was numbered with the transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment. And they said, 'Look, Lord, here are 2 swords.' And he said to them, 'It is enough.'" Verse 35 begins by looking back to when Jesus sent his disciples out into the villages of Israel in Luke chapters 9 and 10. Jesus sent them out as simple, itinerant preachers. And when he did this, he dressed them for the part. They could not take a money bag or a knapsack to carry their possessions, nor could they wear sandals. And although the disciples went out without anything, their needs were supplied. Those they went to recognize them as itinerant preachers and were willing to house and feed them. In verse 36, Jesus dresses his disciples differently. Now they are to take a money bag and a knapsack to carry possessions, and they are to buy 2 swords. The question is, why obtain swords? Did Jesus want them to get swords to protect him? Was he authorizing them to use swords to harm others? Well, fortunately, there's no doubt as to the answer of these questions. For later in this same story, when Peter actually used one of these very swords, Jesus stopped him. He said in Luke 22:51, "No more of this." He said, "Put your sword into its sheath," from John 18, verse 11. And then he healed the man that Peter had wounded, Luke 22, verse 51. He also said in Matthew 26:52, "All who take the sword will perish by the sword." And not long after this, he told Pilate that his followers do not fight John 18, verse 36. It's clear that Jesus was not telling them to get swords to defend him or themselves, for that matter. He was not authorizing them to harm others. We don't need to speculate as to why Jesus said what he said, because he tells us the reason. Back to verse 37. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me, and he was numbered with the transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment. The disciples needed swords in order for the scriptures to be fulfilled. Jesus was to be arrested with a band of people that fit the picture of the lawless ones in Isaiah 53, verse 12, which is the passage Jesus is referring to here. So just as Jesus dressed his disciples to play their role as preachers, now he dresses them as bandits. This is why they needed swords, money bags to carry away money, and knapsacks to carry away possessions. Jesus had a very clear picture of how his betrayal, arrest, and death should transpire based on the scriptures. And this is just one aspect of it. He was to be arrested as if he were the leader of a group of bandits. When the disciples say that they have 2 swords and Jesus responds, "It is enough," he means that the 2 swords are enough for the prophetic picture to work. 2 swords would not have been enough to defend themselves against the group coming to arrest Jesus, but they were enough for them to look like the transgressors of Isaiah 53, verse 12. It was Jesus' intention for them to have at least 2 swords in order to look like bandits, but judging from his response to Peter, it was not his intention that they actually use them. They were to look like a group of bandits, but not act like a group of bandits. All right, so these are Jesus' sword sayings and my thoughts on them. If you have any questions or comments about these, we'll have some time together in class to discuss them.